So can I welcome everybody, both the members of the Salisbury Society and our visitors, who are extremely welcome, to the first of our lunchtime November talks. In previous years, we've held them at our home in the Leeds Library, where we have our library and archives. And given the subject of today's talk, it's a shame that we can't be there, but we do have the advantage that there are people joining us who would have been able to come into Leeds anyway. Just one or two organisational things. I'd ask everybody now to mute their audio so we can't hear any background noise that there might be inside or outside your house. Please know that the meeting is being recorded. It's up to you to decide whether to leave your video on, but if your video is on, note that other people will be able to see you. You can ask questions during the talk by using the chat function, but at the end of the talk, if you want to ask a question in the traditional way, you can turn your audio back on again and ask it in the normal way. Dr. Kevin Grady, who is our speaker today, is so well known that he hardly needs an introduction. If I were to list all his achievements, it would probably take most of the time allocated to the talk. So just let me remind you that Kevin retired recently from 30 very distinguished years as director of the Leeds Civic Trust. He's now the president of the Leeds Library and a great stalwart of the Salisbury Society. His publications on Leeds are very well known. His first publication, The Georgian Public Buildings of Leeds and the West Riding, was published by the Salisbury Society in 1989. And his most recent book, Blue Plaques, the next collection, which is written in conjunction with Robert Tyrrell, was published only last week. And by a fortunate coincidence, both books have some relevance to today's talk. So it's with great pleasure that I invite Kevin to talk to us on the early years of the Leeds Library. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen if I can. However, my lecture today then looks at the early years of the Leeds Library. And in fact, some of you will remember that when the Leeds Library celebrated its 250th anniversary 2 years ago, one of the things that we did was to produce a wonderful volume on the history of the library and about the library in the present day. And so I wrote the first chapter for that, which was about the early years of the library. So this talk is a version of that chapter, but with some variations. So yes, the Leeds Library was 250 in 2018, so it's now 252 years old. It's the oldest surviving subscription library of its type in Britain. Its collection, its wonderful historic buildings and its traditions make it one of the great institutions of Leeds. Once upon a time, the Leeds Library was a very exclusive institution, and there was great competition to become a member by acquiring one of the 500 proprietary shares in the library, in the company which owned the library. Now here you see my share certificate from when I joined in 1987. Noting, interestingly, even in 1987, the library was still known, as you see at the top of the certificate, as Leeds Circulating Library. And you see at the bottom right in the share register, there I am, December 16th, 1987, having registered with that share. And of course, one of the great things about the membership of the library in those days certainly was that you could trace back who had had your share over the previous centuries. And you see, I think back in the 1850s, a solicitor, then a stockbroker, then a managing clerk, etc., an estate agent, and it goes on like that. Now, when I was invited to be a member of the library, to become a proprietor in December 1987, that's 33 years ago, I received a letter from a fellow proprietor, Audrey Marlowe, and she congratulated me on becoming a member and noted that in 1888, her uncle, great uncle, James Close, had received the great honour of being invited to purchase a share in the library. Audrey noted in those days that if you were invited to join the Freemasons in Leeds, and also to be a member of the Leeds Library, that you were made as a professional person in business in Leeds. Well, I'm not a Freemason, but I was very delighted 3 years ago to be honoured by being invited to be president of the library. Well, the library has a fascinating history, and today's lecture reflects on what the town of Leeds was like in 1768 when the library was founded, and it describes the library in its early years. So what was Leeds like in 1768? This view is looking at Briggate in 1825 with the Moot Hall in the centre, just above the junction with Kergate. And it shows a scene which had changed very, very little since 1768. Indeed, it shows the Market Street as it was in those days, which drew thousands of people to the market on Tuesdays and Saturdays, particularly from the hinterland of the West Riding woolen cloth industry, for people to purchase their everyday needs as well as specialist products and services. It was a town dominated by gentlemen woolen cloth merchants who bought their cloth from the small clothiers who made it in their cottages and workshops out in the villages and countryside, particularly and above all to the west of Leeds. These merchants lived in fine houses on Briggate, Kergate, Boar Lane, and just south of the bridge on Meadow Lane and Hunslet Lane. And this panorama of Leeds, drawn by Buck in 1745, gives you a great impression of the town. To us, it looks quite rural, with lots of fields around it and not so densely built up. But if you had been a contemporary at that time, you would have looked at this view and you would have seen a very, very impressive market town and centre of commerce. Indeed, by the late 1760s, its incredibly wealthy gentlemen merchants, such as William Denison, who we see here, with his house on Kergate, these merchants were handling 1/6 of the total exports of the country. There's not just a woolen cloth, just 1/6 of the total exports of the country. So it was a tremendously prosperous town. It had the advantages of the air and cold navigation, which brought in huge quantities of goods and took them out again to the east coast. And shortly after 1768, the bill was passed in Parliament to allow the Leeds and Liverpool Canal to be built. And this gave Leeds access to trade and manufacture across the north of England. Now here we see John Jeffrey's plan of 1770 of the town. It was the first plan that had been published since John Cuzzon's plan of 1726. And it shows that although Leeds had grown in this period, it was still a relatively compact town and surrounded by fields. And in particular, there was no development of the town to the west of Land's Lane. But the plan does show that things were happening, and in the 1750s, because of the great growth of the cloth trade, that south of the river between Hunslet Lane and Meadow Lane, the White Cloth Hall was built, and in the position where City Square is today, the Mixed Cloth Hall was built. It opened, I think, in 1758. Well, the population of Leeds at the time the Leeds Library was founded, the town itself had a population of 15,000 and the borough had a population of 25,000. Now, of course, that seems small to us today, but in fact, this made Leeds the 7th largest town in England. At the same time, well, there are the cloth halls, the white cloth hall and the coloured cloth hall. At the same time, the period of 1768, the religious revival was underway, with George Whitefield and John Wesley were the leading lights. And this view shows the Methodist chapel, later known as the Old Boggart House, first established at Quarry Hill in 1749, but then much enlarged as we see it here in 1771. Now, this is a very interesting map, which was within the Thoresby Society's collection, because it's in fact, it's an updated version of the 1770 Jeffreys plan. This is 1792. And what we see here is that, of course, the gentlemen merchants of Leeds wanted to demonstrate their gentility and refinement and benevolence indeed, and join in the improvement of towns. Basically, the Wilson family, who owned the Park estate to the west side of the town, basically decided it was a great opportunity to develop this high-class residential estate. And so what we see on here is that the first street of the Park estate to be developed was Park Row, running north-south. And that over the next 20 years or so, as we see here, it was developed in various ways. Now, two things that appear newly on this map are, within the rectangle, the coloured cloth hall and the infirmary. Now, the founding of the infirmary, which celebrated its 250th anniversary in 2017, is almost contemporaneous with the founding of the Leeds Library. It was testament to the spirit of improvement and the desire for Leeds to be in the vanguard of the improvement of towns in this period in terms of their cultural and philanthropic amenities. Like the Leeds Library, it began its life, the infirmary, in a yard off Briggate, but then progressed to erecting this wonderful purpose-built infirmary in 1771. Now, the point is that the first subscribers included Dr. Kershaw, the vicar, William Hay, and Dr. Hurd, who were to be founder members of the Leeds Library. But now we move on to the founding of the library itself. Jeffreys again, 1770. Although the Leeds Library is the oldest known surviving library of its type in the British Isles, it was not the first proprietary library to be founded in the country. Kelso had such a library from 1751, and the Leeds Library was modelled on a similar venture in Liverpool in 1758. Proprietary libraries like the Leeds Library were limited in location to the large towns and the popular watering places of the country, and were paralleled in smaller places by book clubs. Yorkshire, for example, in Yorkshire there were proprietary libraries in Bradford, Hull and York, and there were also proprietary libraries in Scarborough and Whitby. But these were all later in their foundation than the Leeds Library. The better known common circulating libraries emerged at an even earlier date and flourished everywhere in the country by the late 18th century. So the question is, where did this big demand for books come from, which gave rise to these lending libraries? First, of course, there was the new spirit of inquiry in science and technology, new thought about theology, a great interest concerning the past and the future of the country. Great seafarers and travellers were making exciting discoveries. and people wanted to read and write about these sort of things. It also brought a great torrent of print in the form of books, magazines, newspapers, ballads and tracts. So there was a lot more around to read. There also arose an exciting form of literature, the novel or romance. So reading was being indulged in for entertainment as well as instruction. I can hear I think somebody is not muted, because I can hear some talking in the background, I think. A new race of avid readers. Can you still hear me, Alan? Alan, can you still hear?
I can hear you.
Okay, fine. Okay, right. There also arose a new and exciting form of literature, the novel or the romance. Reading was indulged in for entertainment as well as instruction. And so there was an avid new race of readers on the market, the ladies, and they were very keen to read the novels of Fanny Burney, Mrs. Radcliffe, Jane Austen, and others now long forgotten. So why establish libraries? Well, basically, books were very expensive, and a lot of people didn't want to add books to their libraries if they were only of short-term interest. But essentially, there were two types of library. The main kinds that lent out books. One was the commercial library, usually conducted by a shopkeeper for profit, and which was ephemeral with a limited stock. The other was a library conducted for the mutual benefit of a group of people, friends or joint owners, which was intended to be a permanent library and in which the stock of books would accumulate. So the Leeds Library was one of these latter types, and almost until the end of the 20th century, as we've seen, although we call the library the Leeds Library, in fact, it was known as the Leeds Circulating Library until maybe 20 years ago. It was a proprietary library, and it was financed entirely by its members, who were joint proprietors and owners of the library's books and fittings. So in August, in August 1768, this prominent notice appeared in the Leeds Intelligencer newspaper, which began, "It is proposed to establish in this town a circulating library upon the plan or one similar to it that shall be more approved by the generality of subscribers." And then it lists the intentions. Every subscriber is to pay a guinea at his admission and 5 shillings a year for the purchase of books, with a little addition for other expenses. The books are to be chosen by a committee of 12 or 20 who are to meet every month and to be elected at an annual general meeting of the subscribers. None of the books are to be sold, but the whole stock is to increase perpetually without any increase of the price of admission. Every subscriber to have power of transferring his property in the library in any manner whatsoever. The notice really was a prospectus for the library, and it went on to say, "A library upon this plan was formed at Liverpool in the year 1758. It is now become very considerable and is a great benefit to the town. It is hoped that the gentlemen and ladies of Leeds will not be backward to follow so good an example, as a library of this nature will be an honour to the town and a capital advantage to the inhabitants, especially in future times." People interested in the proposal were invited to meet at Mr. Myers' newsroom on Briggate a week later to elect officers. And here we see the new King's Arms, of which the hotel of which Mr. Myers was the proprietor. And in this building, later known as Wood's Royal Hotel, the meeting took place in the newsroom. Maybe that was a room upstairs. And interestingly, the frontage of this building still survives on Lower Briggate, except for curious reasons. It was rebuilt in fiberglass. You can tap the building. But anyway, there we are. At the first meeting, it was agreed that the well-known local bookseller, Mr. Ogle, would be the librarian. And at a further meeting on the 5th of October, Mr. Cook's newsroom, the first committee was elected. The first meeting of the committee was held on the 19th of September, 1768, at which the first books were presented. By the end of the year, a catalogue of the books had been produced, including the laws of the library and a list of members. For its first 13 years, the library occupied a back room in the shop of Joseph Ogle, bookseller, at the sign of the Dial, which was at the top of Kergate, that is to say, at the Briggate end. Well, thanks to the unearthing of this wonderful drawing, which was based on a painting made in about 1800, we know precisely where Mr. Ogle's bookshop was and what it looked like. And you can see on here, just on the right-hand side, we're on the Briggate end of Kergate. You can see Mr. Ogle's bookshop arrowed there, and just on the first floor you can see the dial or sundial, which gave rise to the notion of the library being at the sign of the dial. And for orientation purposes, you can see on the left-hand side of this slide the arrow which points to Fish Street, so you can see what location the library was then, and you compare it with the location today. As I've said, Joseph Ogle was the first librarian. He died in 1774, and his wife Hannah took a Mr. Smith as a partner in the shop, and that business became known as Ogle and Smith. But interestingly, the role of librarian passed to Joseph's daughter, Mary. Mary Ogle in 1776 married John Robinson, and as the newly married Mrs. Mary Robinson, she remained librarian of the library for the next 39 years till her death in 1813. Now, it's interesting thinking of the members of the library probably going in through this door and get in the back room where the library collection was kept. And it was here in 1779 that James Boswell, the biographer of Dr. Johnson, would have met Mary Robinson and the committee members. He'd gone there because he wanted to consult the manuscripts of Thomas Wilson about the pedigrees of the gentry and nobility. We still have them, of course, in the library, and James Boswell wrote, "In Leeds, where one would not expect it, there is a very good public library, where strangers are treated with great civility, of which I, for one, retain a grateful sense." So, happily for the Leeds Library, its stock of books did increase and accumulate, and the rooms at the Dial became too small. In 1781, it moved to a new home closer by. Joseph Wood, a hatter and laceman, offered accommodation in an imposing house in Kergate, which formerly had been the grand home of Sir James Ibbotson. Here we see an illustration of that house from the Cousin's 1726 plan, and the house had until recently been occupied by Reverend Dr. Gooding. Now, both these people, Ibbotson and Gooding, were members of the library. In 1726, the house had been illustrated, as we see in John Cousin's plan, and it stood at the junction of Vicar Lane and Kergate. Actually, the house had been significantly altered since John Cousin's time. The Ibbotsons had entirely rebuilt it, and projected the front out 5 feet across the pavement of Kirkgate. And here, fortunately for us, we see half of the house on the right-hand side on John Russell's painting of Kirkgate in 1803. The library room, which was described as a spacious and lofty apartment, was on the ground floor of the house, while on the floor above was the rotation office. This is where the borough magistrates met in rotation on Tuesdays and Fridays to administer justice. The rest of the ground floor of the house was occupied by Ogle and Robinson's bookshop. And in this curious Victorian view, we see the rotation office yard, which ran through from Coal Lane through to Kirkgate, and we see the back of the library building at the end of the yard. And it's interesting to note that an insurance policy of 1796 included not only the library and the rotation office building, but also 2 dwellings in the occupation of the chief constable and the librarian. Possibly these are the small buildings on the left-hand side of the picture. Well, what of the members and founders of the library? The library's committee of 20, which met for the first time in September 1768, was made up of some of the most noted names in the history of 18th century Leeds. They were from the Leeds elite, they were middle class, and they were wealthy. The member best known today was Joseph Priestley, then aged 35. He was the minister of the Unitarian Chapel at Mill Hill, and later became famous, as we know, as the scientist who was thought to have discovered oxygen. He was the first secretary of the library. 2 other committee members were the Reverend Kershaw, the Vicar of Leeds, and the Reverend William Lupton. Prominent members of the committee came from the merchant community, and these included Joseph and Samuel Oates, whose grand house, townhouse, still stands on Briggate, Lower Briggate today. 2 other rich woolen merchants, committee members, were business partners Jeremiah Dixon, Esquire, and Thomas Lee. Now here we see top left Dixon's house, which he built on Boar Lane next to Holy Trinity Church in 1750, but which he'd recently sold on to his partner Thomas Lee. At the same time, Jeremiah had bought Gledhow Hall, the estate, and at the time the Leeds Library was being founded, the architect John Carr, the architect of Harewood House, had just completed Dixon's Gledhow Hall house for him. Industrialist members of the committee were John and Robert Green, who ran the famous Leeds Pottery in Hunslet. Here we see the pottery with John Green. His brother and partner, Robert Green, was treasurer of the library. Though not on the committee, another prominent member was Charles Brandling, the owner of Middleton Colliery and the Middleton Railway. And on the left, we see his portrait painted by Sir Joshua Reynolds in about 1760. I mean, these were high status people. Medical doctors were also prominent members of the library. Its first president was James Kenyon, while Dr. William Hurd, the first physician of the new infirmary, was a committee member from the outset. William Hayes, seen on the right, the infirmary's most famous surgeon, sat on the committee from 1776. The membership of the library grew steadily. The original catalogue shows that there were 105 members, but by 1781, membership had increased to 300. There can be no doubt that the membership of the library was a compact group of people who were professionally associated. They were friends, acquaintances, but there was quite a lot of intermarriage between members' families. Most of the first members of the library can be found in the annals of Leeds Corporation as mayors, or many of them as corporation members of the corporation and common councillors. In its early years too, and in subsequent years, the library was to number amongst its members the Becketts, the Gotts, the Marshalls, the Luptons, and many of the well-known names in Leeds history. Well, what about the books? The stock grew steadily. The first catalogue in 1768 listed 503 books. By 1780, there were 2,500. What sort of books were they collecting? Well, the early catalogues of the library, which we still have, show the first aim was to produce a sort of extended gentleman's library. The largest section of the books in the 1768 catalogue were devoted to belles lettres, with a prominent place for standard sets of works by English writers. But ancient classics were quite few. There was little on theology and only the odd book of philosophy, science, or the useful arts. The 1778 catalogue shows that the collecting of the first decade, literature was predominant, but critical magazines and standard authors had been added, and plays were also something that the library collected and read. Amongst the works of fiction were the expected books, so Samuel Richardson's Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, in 4 volumes, and Clarissa in 8. There was Lawrence Sterne's Tristram Shandy in 8 volumes, and his Sentimental Journey in 2. Swift's Gulliver's Travels could be had in 12 volumes in a set, and the works of Fielding were there, Tom Jones, etc. Members could read the Arabian Nights, Persian Tales, The Devil on Crutches, sounds rather fascinating, and The Bachelor of Salamanca. And then Voltaire's works were there in 35 volumes, and the works of other foreign writers, but in English translations. The history and antiquities formed the next largest group of books, followed closely by travel and natural history. Here we see an illustration of William Stukeley's Stonehenge, a temple restored to the British Druids that had been published in 1740. And of course, the library still has many, in fact, most of these volumes. Well, how did the library run? The library was open from 10 till 4 for business, but members could read up to 6 p.m. upon gratifying the librarian. We must presume there was an interconnecting door between the library room and the shop. An advertisement in the Leeds Intelligencer at the end of, an advertisement at the end of the 1768 catalogue explained that in order to avoid giving the librarian unnecessary trouble, persons who come to take out books are desired to rap on the door when they've absolutely fixed on the volume they've chosen, and they will be waited upon immediately. There is no occasion for the attendance of the librarian on the delivery, that is to say, the return of a book, it being sufficient to leave it upon the table. It all sounds very cozy, doesn't it? The committee chose the books by ballot, but any member had the right to command a ballot for any book that he or she proposed. There was provision for fines, and in 1776 it was decided that members living over 3 miles from the library could return their books on the first market day after the expiration of the time limit. Well, what about missing books? Or, well, let's see. At the AGM in 1777, it was decreed that the committee should have the power of suppressing any book of an indecent and immoral tendency until the next AGM. Now, this rule lasted until 1881. At the 1777 AGM, the committee was instructed by the members to immediately destroy Make Mistakes of the Heart, a book by a Frenchman, and The Pupil of Pleasure was to be destroyed, a lurid and harrowing tale of illicit love and its consequences. When the committee met the following week, they found somebody had scrawled in their minute book, quote, "We sincerely hope the committee has too much sense to pay any regard to such ridiculous orders." Now, you'd be happy to know that these books were not destroyed, but unfortunately, search as much as I can, I've never been able to find them. Of course, there were offences, which this item from the Leeds Intelligence shows, when 2 pages disappeared from the political register in June 1770, which, you note, had never been out of the library. The committee was scandalised and placed this advert in the Leeds Intelligencer, offering a reward of 1 guinea for the discovery and detection of the miscreants, who, of course, we were all very nice members of the library, and it said that they really preferred to think that it must be one of the subscriber's servants rather than the subscriber themselves. Oh, there we go. We now move on to the erection of the library's purpose-built premises in the early 19th century. Of course, there'd been disruption to trade because of the Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, but nevertheless, Leeds had acquired some new streets. And we see on this plan, running down the centre of this square, is Albion Street. This had been created in 1790-91 as to be a high quality thoroughfare, part of the West End of Leeds. In 1802, a new street was cut between Albion Street and Land's Lane. Today we know it as Commercial Street, but in those days it was known as Bond Street. Albion Street, I say, was a prestigious street. It had the new music hall, that is a concert hall there. Then it was here that the concerts were held for the middle classes, and the art gallery of Leeds was also created, as we see in this view. Very fortunately for us, the artist John Russell, on his visit to Leeds, also painted this picture of Albion Street. And on the right, well, more or less centrally here, we see William Hayes' house on Albion Place, which is still there. And then just below it, the house on the right here, where this pile of bricks, this is where Commercial Street, or in their terms, Bond Street, was created. By 1804, it was clear that the library needed more space. It had existed for over 30 years, so there was great confidence in the institution. And at the 1804 AGM, it was resolved unanimously that the most eligible mode of procuring a new library is the building of a new one by subscription. Progress was rather slow, but at a special general meeting on the 16th of July 1806, it was agreed that a plot of land on Commercial Street should be bought for erecting thereon a library buildings and such other buildings as hereafter are provided. The town's leading architect, Thomas Johnson, was appointed with a fee of 100 guineas. While the site is a relatively shallow one on Commercial Street and there was a tight budget, this, although it limited the architectural flamboyance of what Johnson could do, nevertheless he produced an elegant neoclassical building which was impressive in its time. Now, as you see, the idea of incorporating shops on the ground floor of the building was a brilliant one, for it was the rents, and still is the rents from the shops on the ground floor, which ensured the survival of the library for the next 212 years as it now is. It was probably the desire of the librarian Mary Robinson to be able to move her business, bookshop business, to this location that prompted the inclusion of the shops. The cost of the library was £5,000 and it was opened in July 1808. The main room of the library, which we see here, was so lofty that initially it must have looked rather bare. We presume that the bookshelves only went halfway up the walls, and in those days there were no freestanding bookshelves in the middle of the floor, and indeed on the right hand side, halfway down the long side of the library, was a large fireplace. It's interesting that there are no records of the purchase of candles or any form of lighting for the library in the accounts of the library in this period, so it assumes that the opening hours of the library from 10 till 4 reflected the fact that people read their books entirely by daylight. So, what of the members of the library? Well, the library's increased facilities, the fact that it had now got a large debt to repay, the £5,000, and also there was high inflation, meant that the prices of being a subscriber to the library, and indeed its shares, went up considerably. The price of a ticket, as they called it, that's a share, had increased to 4 guineas by 1805. And by 1822, it had increased to £22, while the subscription had risen to 25 shillings. Here we see Henry Hall, one of the stalwart members of the Leeds Library, see that he became a member in 1796 and was a member effectively for 60 years. You'll recognize this bust because you see it as you go up the steps up to the main room of the library on the left-hand side. So he was absolutely fundamental and a man of great works in Leeds. But of course, the fact was that this high price for shares meant that you kept out, as it were, the lower orders. You had to be pretty wealthy to buy one of these things. But of course, the shares were available for sale and you could sell them in any way. Therefore, there was a broadening of the membership of the library in terms of social class. And we see here Joshua Bower, a radical Wesleyan self-made glass manufacturer. And we see his glassworks in Hunslet as they looked in 1827. He became a member in 1827, was a member for about 9 years. Now, the thing was that what did members think about this? Because it was said he retained his coarse speech and bluff manner, which revealed his humble origins. Well, subscribers could sell their tickets, as I've said, so there could be no control who joined. The tickets were sold by auction, and quite frequently you'd see the adverts for them appearing in the local newspapers. So that, at an auction, in 1832, when the surgeon John Wade died, it said that included in the auction of his possessions at the music hall were 40 dozen bottles of crusted port, sherry, and Madeira, a quantity of plate and jewels, and 2 Leeds Library tickets. Following the death of Jonathan Taylor, at the auction of his property in 1835, it included investments in turnpikes, 5 £50 shares in the Leeds Central Market, his pew at St Paul's Church, Park Square, and his library ticket. Well, the library had had women subscribers from the start. In 1817, there were 72 out of the 478 subscribers, though this number had fallen to 42 by 1836. Here we see Ellen Heaton, one of the most eccentric and notable lady members of the library. She's referred to as, Alan said in the Blue Plaques book. There were no lady subscribers who became committee members before the reign of Queen Victoria, and indeed Janet Douglas, writing about the lady members of the library, reckons there was no lady member of the management committee until 1921. What about opening hours? A proposal to extend the opening hours of the library was mooted at the 1825 annual general meeting. This was proposed by Sir Edward Baines on the right here, looking rather older than his father, Edward Baines on the left, Edward Baines Senior. They were both proprietors of the Leeds Mercury and both became MPs for Leeds. There was this motion to extend the opening hours into the evening so that young men could come into the library and escape the difficulties of a domestic household where they would be disturbed and they could do considerable study. Well, there was a wrangle about this, but it was rejected by various members, saying that they did not wish to change the library into a lounging place for young men. Whether members of the Leeds Library lounge in the library today, who is to say? Well, I've got about 5 minutes, so I think I'm okay. What about the library and its collection? Well, by the 1790, the library had 4,500 books. By the end of the 19th century, it had 60,000 books. The immediate thought of people coming into the library today thinks that with an institution that is over 250 years old, that the library must have lots and lots of very, very valuable first editions of all sorts of books. Well, of course, we do have lots of first editions. For example, we have the first edition of Darwin's Origin of Species. But of course, the thing is that, of course, people read books, and that many of, particularly the novels of which we had first editions, just simply wore out over time because people read them, and so we replaced them. However, the physically larger books, which were primarily for reference purposes, did survive. But here are some examples of some of the wonderful books. The oldest book we have is Sir John de Mandeville's Travels in the Holy Land, printed in Venice in 1483. If you want to read it, you have to note that it's in Latin. But then we have a really significant collection of something like 100 Reformation tracts dating from the 16th century. And of course, they are tremendously valuable. We also are very proud of the collection of 661, well, it says 610 here, but Civil War tracts, probably the largest collection in Britain. And on the right, you see Sir Henry Hyde's speech on the scaffold immediately before his execution. So exciting stuff. We also have many wonderful illustrated books about natural history and explorers' accounts of their travels. Here on the left, we have an illustration from August Johann Rosel's Natural History volumes, dated from 1746 to 1766. And on the right, we have the head of a polar bear from Captain John Ross's Voyages of Discovery in the polar regions in the 1820s. Particularly splendid are pictures like this of East Timor in 1824 from Louis de Freycinet's Voyage of Discovery, his circumnavigation of the globe. And then we have a great range. So here, for example, we have 7,000 Victorian novels, many of which are not even available in the British Library. But then emphasizing the range, we have on the left the first English edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, while on the right we have the box, which contains our first edition of Ian Fleming's first James Bond novel, Casino Royale. Our in-house, well, until recently in-house binder and conservator Brian has a sense of humour, and he decided that he must put bullet holes in the box in which the book is kept. So, the library has continually changed. The main room accommodation Today we have 140,000 books in total, but the challenge of accommodating these books has become considerable. In 1821, the accommodation of the main room was increased by putting in a gallery on the east side with the spiral staircase. And in 1835, north and west galleries were added. In 1881, this room, which even 139 years later we still call the new room, was added at the back of the building, and this was the last significant enlargement of the library. Well, bringing us right up to date then, in the last 20 years there have been major changes to the organisation and membership of the library. When I became a proprietor in 1987, we had 500 proprietors, and that was it. It was a private library, and if you could come in for research purposes, but other than that, you needed to be a member of the library. Towards the end of the 1980s, we decided we'd like to broaden the accessibility of the library, and therefore we introduced a class of associate member, and that allowed 150 other people to have regular use of the library. But we didn't think that had gone far enough. And so in 2008, we decided to turn the library into a charity. And as proprietary members, we gave up our proprietary rights so that the library membership could be very significantly expanded as real and proper members of the library. And so today we have 1,000 members, and for £11 a month, people really do enjoy the benefits for a relatively modest subscription of the library, which of course is a modern library in the sense that we buy, I think, something like 1,500 new books every year, or they might be DVDs, CDs, or whatever. We have the newspapers and the journals and what have you, and it is a wonderful modern library, but with its historic connections and collection. We were particularly pleased approximately 4 years ago that the Thoresby Society joined us in the library, and it's now its headquarters, as you all know. And here we have the Thoresby Room, which combines the book collections of the Thoresby Society and the Leeds Library, books about Leeds and the West Riding or West Yorkshire. And of course, there is also a room in which the wonderful archive of the Thoresby Society is kept. So this room and associated archives is a wonderful facility for people to study the history of our area. In our 250th anniversary year, we created or refurbished the entrance hall to the library, and it really is a splendid improvement. And it's through here that most of us listening go through on a regular basis, although sadly not in the current climate. And finally, just to say, if you would like to read more about the history of the library,
trade deal with America is, I think, only going to be seriously possible with Trump.
No, I don't know what we're hearing now. We're hearing about Donald Trump. But anyway, the key point is to say that this book is available. You can buy it for £25 from the Leeds Library. And of course, Christmas is coming. So not only should you buy the Blue Plaques of Leeds book, but you can buy this wonderful volume, which, you can bring up the library email and you'll be able to buy a copy. So there we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for that most interesting talk. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Nobody's posted a question on the chat, so I suggest if you want to ask a question, you unmute yourself and ask the question verbally. Who's got a question? Well, while people are thinking of questions, Kevin, I have a question. I noticed you talked about the novels not having first editions because they'd been read and worn.
Yes.
Is there evidence that despite many of the other more distinguished books the library had, it was the novels that people really wanted to borrow to read in the early days.
Well, I think there was always a debate in the library about this issue of was it proper that the Leeds Library should have all these books? I mean, if you're able to go down in the basement these days, the Victorian fiction is at the end of the basement. I mean, you've got, the problems with red rust and all this sort of thing, but you read some of the titles and some of them are really sensational sort of stuff, and you can imagine that there was going to be a debate amongst members over whether we should be buying sort of edifying books, or should we be buying the fiction. But undoubtedly the fiction was very popular. But of course, one of the main things about the library is that it's been able to, I noticed somewhere that it said in the early years that members of the committee would vote a ballot as whether books that were recommended to be bought should be was suitable for members. And I remember, even say when I was on the general committee 20 years ago, we were still voting on whether, books that cost, maybe it was more than £50 should be bought. But I think that, the library over its history has managed to get a nice balance of, these sort of edifying books, literature, and these sort of things on all sorts of topics, and, the popular novel. So, yes, I think it's a tricky one. Thinking about books that couldn't be bought, I remember an issue coming up over whether the library should buy a copy of Nancy Reagan's autobiography, and personally, I would have thought we should buy it, but members of the committee thought that this was such rubbish, it shouldn't be in the Leeds Library.
Okay, does anyone have a question they would like to ask?
Yes, great lecture, Kevin, as ever, wonderfully presented. Do we know who owned the site on which the current library was built, and how much was paid for the site?
Well, you may know the answer. This may be a trick question, Steve.
No, it isn't. No, it isn't a trick question. But I do not know.
Because the interesting thing is, I assume that this detail must be in the library records somewhere. Of course, the interesting thing was that when the site was bought, of course, it also, the land immediately behind it was bought, and that on that site, the Leeds Intelligence, I think it was, maybe it was the Leeds Mercury office printing works was built behind it. And of course, in a sense, that was a good thing. Because, this was, we bought it when Albion Street was still effectively a development site, and there were plots there, and you think, well, the library thought, we'll grab that because that's a very high class part of the town centre. But of course, fortunately for the library, it was able to demolish the printing works of the newspaper, and that gave us the space to put the new room on there, because I think Chris Webster is listening to the talk, and as Chris said in his chapter of the book about the Leeds Library, through the pages, that of course that's periodically, and it always comes up in sort of about the 1870s, 1880s, the question was whether the library should actually move to a new location, and there was a scheme that maybe the Philosophical Society and the library and maybe one other institution would build a much grander building somewhere else, I think probably with a dome and things like that. And well, probably fortunately for the Leeds Library, we didn't go for that. But the issue of the suitability of the site and what you could do with it. And of course, today we have still, as well as the number of books increases and as the library has extended its range of activities with all the events that we hold at the library, there is an issue about whether the library should move again, or more particularly to buy second premises. And well, I think in the current situation, that is unlikely to happen. I think we'll always keep the building, but I think the key thing is, we do need more space. It's a problem of that rule right at the start that no books will ever be disposed of.
Thank you, Kevin. Do we have any more questions?
Can I ask something? Sorry, it's Anne Bennett. Yes.
Do.
Can I ask, when there were originally the original members, was it just the members who could use the library, or was it their household as well? And if so, how large was the household allowed to be?
Yes, now that's a very interesting question, because of course, when you look at the membership of women, I mean, in one sense, the number of women who were independently members of the library was relatively high for the period, but the assumption was, the assumption was that it was in effect a family membership, so that the wives of proprietors certainly could borrow, and in some of the later catalogues, it does say that servants, by which they meant governesses, could also use the library, so that your sort of ticket did allow other people to come in. I suspect, well, you rather suspect that people who were, well, certainly servants in the sense of governesses, probably could just pop in and take books away. But so it was broader than it might initially appear, although when I talked about the debate that was held about whether the library should be opening in the evening for young men, the issue there was that I think it was Michael Sadler, the politician and wool factor, said that he thought that actually since all the members of the library were pretty much men of business, that there shouldn't be any difficulty. They were employers, but they shouldn't have much difficulty in getting away from the library to come and use it during the daytime.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Hello.
No, yes, you go ahead.
Thank you. Has the National Library got access to books that only you have?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? One of the things that we're thinking about, particularly with these sort of 7,000, obviously some of the books we've got are unique, but when you look at, say, the Victorian fiction, of which there's this large collection, we're in a bit of a quandary about them, because obviously, some of the books are being conserved, but when you've got, say, 7,000 of them, it's a huge task, and the issue of conservation is a concern for the library. There has been discussion about whether it would be possible to scan the books, the Victorian fiction, which we think are, we may have at the only copy. And if we did that, there is an ambition to make them available online. So in a sense, the answer to your question is that yes, no doubt, if the British Library or some grant-giving body were inclined to give us a grant, which we'd very much like to have to finance the digitising of the Victorian fiction, then we're very keen to do it.
Thank you.
I think we've just got time for one more question, if anyone would like to ask a question. I think people are still absorbing all the information that.
Well, I think it's time for lunch, isn't it? If you didn't eat beforehand, you certainly want to afterwards.
Can I just end the meeting by thanking Kevin for his most wonderful, interesting, informative lecture? I'm afraid you won't get the round of applause that you deserve, because most people are muted, but I will.